in keeping with experiential stuff, I promised myself I wouldn't use too many things, and so you're welcome for this. How many of you are joining us brand new who were not here in hour one? Very good. Welcome to traffic, how it interacts. A longitudinal study of gasoline, no. So this is experiential therapy and how it accesses the right brain. I'm Carlos Martinez, clinical supervisor at on-site workshops, for those of you who didn't hear that part in part one. So we finished up talking about, just kind of a brief overview, how the right brain is really rooted in experience, in synesthetics and kinesthetics, in processing, whereas the left brain is going to be reserved for analytics, for language, for conceptual ideas, and the work of the therapist is to be able to meet the person who's showing up in therapy in that right brain modality, in the experience of what's happening to them in the moment. And being able to meet that person in the experience and help them evaluate, this is what I'm feeling, is what's going to help really turn the tide in becoming aware. And I would say this is really endemic to the population and to my own recovery work as well, that if you ask someone early in recovery or who hasn't started the journey yet with a history of trauma, ask the person what they're feeling. What am I what? What are you feeling? And so many trauma survivors are so profoundly disconnected from their bodies that it's almost impossible for them to say, this is what I'm feeling. Because we've had to divorce ourselves from the reality of what my body is saying, that it's very easy to live up in the logic in the prefrontal cortex area of my brain in dealing with what I think is logic and reason and rationality. Now, I may, driven by my history of trauma, I may steer into things that my logic brain is constantly asking me, what are you doing? But I will tell myself the story that I'm fine, the other F word, I'm fine. The three F words, the actual F word and then the other F word, the fine, and then the real bad, the F word, which is forgive, which that's a whole other thing. But in this work, having people connect with what they're actually feeling, with what they are experiencing in the moment, that's half the work itself. So what I wanted to do is tell you and show you a working schematic of the triune brain. This model comes to us from Paul MacLean in the mid to late 60s, where he came up with this idea that we have in us a trifecta of a brain. So the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the reptile, what we call the reptile brain, and that's responsible for super basic life, breathing, blinking, heart rate, drive. And then there's the midbrain, sometimes called the monkey brain, the amygdala, the HPA axis, which is the emotion center. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, the part up here, which is the rational mind. And so could I, since you've entered into an experiential workshop, I'm going to ask you to volunteer so you can experience. Any volunteers to kind of see a working model of this? What it might look like. So I need one. I need two more volunteers. Okay, very good. I need one more volunteer. Good. Okay, so now here's an experience. I'd like you to arrange yourselves by height, with the tallest person in the back here. Yeah, and so Where? I'm not telling anybody. What's your name?
Anne.
Anne, I'm sorry to inform you, you're a little bit shorter. Yeah. But there's no. Okay. Also, I lied. I need 2 more volunteers for this part. So 1, very good, and you're so brave. 1 more. So volunteer? You've been voluntold. Yes. Yeah. So, all right. So, here's where we get down and dirt. So, now I'm going to have you on the wall back there, on your side, and Peter here, on that side. Now, playing the role of here we have. I'm so glad they gave me all this space to work with. So.
Big room.
But yes, playing the role of the lizard brain, the reptile brain, is Anne. And you're responsible for breathing, blinking, heart rate, basic drive kinds of things. So if, for those of the uninitiate, and I said I'm not a scientist and I don't play one on TV, but if you take your hand, hold it up like this part here where your palm meets your wrist, that would be the reptile brain, the basal ganglia. If you fold your thumb in here and then close your fingers over that, these 2 middle fingers will be your eyes. The thumb here would represent the midbrain, the amygdala, that emotion center, and then this part here would be the prefrontal cortex. And so your job is to ask the question, am I alive? Super basic. That's your job, is to figure out, am I alive? Am I breathing? Am I blinking? Am I using enough resources to just hold on to basic life? And you are? Shalini?
Yeah.
Shalini. So your job is to be the monkey mind, and your job is to ask the functioning body, am I safe? Now, this fully matures by age 3-ish. And so you can imagine, to a toddler, to a child, the question, am I safe, and am I loved, are the same question. Because a child doesn't know a world in which they would be not loved and safe. So for that child, am I safe and am I loved are the same experience. Now, and your name?
Anna.
Anna is playing the role of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, if it were to ask a question, it would be asking the question, does this make sense? Or what can I learn from this? And generalities apply, but by most standards, you come fully online in your mid-20s. Mm-hmm. So, prenatal, age 3-ish, mid-20s. And so what happens is we have here a functioning brain, and these 2, Peter and, your name again? Bobby, are going to act as a trapdoor between the lower 2 parts of the brain, which consume, any guesses as to what percentage these 2 parts of the brain consume overall? 70? 85-ish. 85-ish. And so if you think of these 2 as massive 5-lane superhighways, and Anna is consuming 10-ish%, and you would be represented by small country byroads, small roads to get you home. And so we have a person who's driving home, and am I alive? Am I safe? Am I loved? Does this make sense? You're driving home, and suddenly a deer hops in front of the car, and you swerve, you pull on the brakes, you swerve, and that essentially that trap door goes up. So you're going to hold that door up so that now the prefrontal cortex is offline, And any guesses to how long that prefrontal cortex is going to be offline? 20 minutes. 20 minutes where the prefrontal cortex is offline, and these two are running the show. Yeah. Shalini, that is perfect. Usually I have a bullhorn with an alarm on it. I think I like that better. So for the next 20 minutes, you're going to be doing that. The monkey mind is going to be doing this, saying, am I safe? I don't know if I'm safe. I'm not safe. I'm not safe. Alarms. So what happens is that emergency workers come on the scene. You're fine, the car's fine, but you had to pull over and you almost got into a wreck, and so your body is shaking, which is what would happen with a body that's gone through trauma. So Peter Leland has taught us that a body having gone through trauma is going to discharge the trauma to try and get rid of it. Now, a well-meaning worker shows up on the scene and sees you shivering. What do? They give you a blanket. Yeah, we need to stop that shivering right now. And so what happens is that shivering stops the body from discharging the trauma, and now it's stuck there. So 20 minutes later, slowly the curtain comes down, and you get in the car, you go home, everything's fine. Everything's fine. Now, what if you walk in the door and it's not a deer that runs in front of the car, but your partner looks at you and says, "What happened?" Curtain goes up. Because now it's about a facial expression. Because you're wondering, am I safe and am I loved? And the person that I'm relying upon for my safety, for my love, for my security, my belonging, now is looking at me like, oh, this is my fault. Or I should have known better. And so for the next 20 minutes, again, this prefrontal cortex, they're offline. Now what happens when you go home and you see a facial expression and no words? Someone that you care about just gives you the look. And suddenly, you're 5, and suddenly you're in that space where you are not loved, you're not safe, you're not taken care of. And your world is just spinning. And that's what happens when this trapdoor goes up and we're not able to access our prefrontal cortex. So can we thank our volunteers for coming up? Beautiful job. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So, and Robert Sapolsky, I think he's a Harvard researcher, he wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. He said, zebras on the Serengeti Plain, you have a zebra who's really thirsty and at the watering hole and suddenly gets chased by a lion, and through luck and through speed is able to get away. 20 minutes later, that zebra is not at the watering hole going, what am I doing with my life? I need to think about my choices. I should have gone to art school. The zebra is not thinking about what happened. The zebra's alive. But what happens is we get into our car and we replay the conversation with our boss or our partner over and over and over again, and we start instilling in ourselves, we start recreating the soup of the HPA axis, of going back and reliving that unsafe moment. We recreate it over and over again. I said this before, I'm going to say it again. I apologize for showing you this video. It is called the Still Face Experiment, and it's, so steel yourselves. This is a trigger warning. I hate it. And there's no other video that can really conceptualize and crystallize the concepts that I'm talking about. This is essentially attachment theory in progress. And so I'm going to ask for the video for this part here. It's a 30-second clip. It's going to be a little grainy, like the ones before, but there's something incredibly important that the Edward Tonic says.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction.
So what he's mentioning here, this is a callback to early attachment theory with John Bowlby, and I highly recommend the book Becoming Attached. I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but the book is called Becoming Attached, and he talks about the cultural war and the dynamic, the paradigmatic shift of old psychoanalytic theory with Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, and the culture war that happened between Anna Freud and John Bowlby. John Bowlby came on the scene and started really challenging the ideas at the time. And at the time, the idea was that babies didn't really have emotions. Babies cannot react emotionally to their environment. There's no mental health of a baby. And John Bowlby came along and essentially said, yeah, there is, and they are, and they do feel. And so what Dr. Tonic here is saying is that there was a time in our history where we didn't even think that babies could have an emotional health or emotional life. And so now we're starting to understand with attachment theory, with Mary Ainsworth and is that right? Ainsworth did the strange experiment. It was Mary Main who did the adult attachment interview. That the strange experiment is true across cultures, whether it was Uganda or in Massachusetts. The reactions of an infant are always going to be the same because they're endemic to humans. And we're going to see this clip. Again, I apologize. We're going to see what happens when this mother is told that for the next 2 minutes, it's not 2 minutes, it's about 30 seconds, thank God. But the mother is told, do not respond emotionally to the baby, and we're going to see what happens.
In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Horrible. And look how quick that is. Yeah.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
one of the things I focus on in my work with groups and in programs that I lead, I'll say it's never about the rip, it's always about the repair. You see how quick that baby was able to come back because of a repair. We rip in relationships all the time. That's sometimes the nature of relationships, is that we have rips, we have misunderstandings, we have times where we overpower one another, or we let each other down, or we have the basic experience of life, and it is in the repair that we can have a moment of going back to, okay, they do see me. Sometimes it's the safety of the repair that lets us be able to experience and really flesh out what a rip would be like. I think it's Yalom who said that he can tell when a group, a psychodynamic group is really healthy, when it's really humming, is when a participant is able to get angry at the group leader. He says that that's a wonderful moment when a participant can express rage at the group leader, because the group leader can fold that experience in to themselves and reflect back, not only can I survive your anger, you can survive your anger. Alan Shore, who does a lot of research in right brain to right brain connecting, talks about the importance of the mother or the primary caregiver being able to reflect back emotions, which is the right brain dominance I'll talk about that in a minute, but the importance of not just the healthy emotions or the positive emotions, but the importance of holding space for negative emotions, for infants to feel anger and sadness so that they can grow up and start to feel complex emotions like grief and loss. And so it's in holding those experiences that the right brain to right brain modeling teaches the infant to hold space for themselves, for the whole panoply of emotions. This, however, is the experience of many of us. A child that's being abused by its parents, they don't stop loving themselves. They don't stop loving their parents. They stop loving themselves. And so what I find is helpful for this diagram. It's not useful for necessarily, and I'm going to make sure anybody who would be interested, I'll speak with the facilitators here at iCAAD. If you'd like a copy of the slides and the bibliography, I'm more than happy to share that. But this diagram here, not necessarily to conceptualize I'm a right brain person or a left brain person, but instead to think about what Alan Shore talks about is that in these years of development, in year one, the right brain comes online. And again, going back to that concept of the unthought known, that a child in that first year of development, if they have moments where they're not seen, where they're not mirrored, where they're not able to find a reflection of themselves because they're not mirrored by the mother like we saw in the video and like you experienced, if they don't have that in year one, when the right brain is being developed, there are key developmental stages that are important to meet. Anyone ever heard the statement, the neurons that fire together wire together? So that's good news, and it's not. Because the converse of that is also the neurons that don't fire together won't wire together. And if infants meet those, if they meet them, that's great. If they miss those developmental markers, the neurons that should have fired together will not wire together. And that child is going to be at a deficit and will have to work extra hard later in their recovery and circumvent ways to make connections possible so that they can key into what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. This is shown in lab studies of lab animals that are, for example, this is horrible to say, but they use, for some reason, they use puppies. But they would tape over one of the eyes of the puppies and didn't do anything to it, but just taped over the eye. And the brain went through its normal spurt of development and then untaped the eye. And because the puppies had missed those developmental marks, the eyes didn't work. And those parts of the brain just simply didn't develop. And there was no going back and fixing it. And so this is trauma. And what I've had to try and understand in my work is that there is one concept of educating the people that I work with and saying, this is trauma, you're entitled to your experience. There are neat bar graphs and charts to say, no, it was real, it was absolutely present for you, and they can acknowledge it up here. And if there is a denial system in place to keep them from seeing something too soon or something that they aren't ready to conceptualize or synthesize yet, they won't be able to get there. And so the next part here is how experiential therapy accesses that right brain. Now, these responses to trauma are all, they're part of our understanding of addiction overall. So codependency, one of my recoveries, it shows up in codependency and drinking and self-harm, dissociation, all of the things that people use and do to try and escape from that trauma experience. It makes complete sense. I think it was Cindy who said that all of our, I can't remember who she was quoting, all our behavior makes sense. Anything that you do behaviorally, it makes total sense considering who you are, where you come from, your family history, what you've had to survive. It makes total and complete sense. Now, I'm going to get into some concepts here. I'm going to say in advance, again, this may gel against, this may gel with some of your understandings of trauma. It may rub against your understanding of trauma. I'm going to ask for some leeway here. How many of you have heard the term, so the response to danger is fight, flight, freeze. So we know that, so fight, flight, freeze. And there's a researcher, Rebecca Campbell, in the Michigan State University, who has done a lot of research, and this study is actually, this was done in connection with the Department of Justice in the United States of America. But she, as a researcher, found that there's a whole other response and in a different order to trauma, and that is called tonic immobility, which is primarily the freeze response. And the idea here is that the freeze shows up first. And the reason why we say fight, flight, freeze is much more a function of our language than it is of the chemistry and the biochemistry that happens in a trauma response, in a danger response. It's just that it's not easy to say freeze, fight, flight. It's much more language-based, and so for the same way that we say tick-tock instead of talk-tick, we say ding-dong instead of dong-ding. I saw a meme the other day that said, if you meet someone that says that they eat jelly and peanut butter sandwiches, that person is a psychopath and you need to run from them immediately. Nobody eats jelly and peanut butter sandwiches. It's peanut butter and jelly. And so it flows off the tongue. It's so much easier to say fight, flight, freeze. And so much damage has been done putting those words in that order. Before I started at Onsite, I worked for 5 years in the counseling center at a university in New Jersey, and I worked as primarily the rape and crisis, sexual assault, trauma counselor, incest, recovery. And I became well-versed and well-associated with this response of freeze, flight, fight only in as much, we fight only in as much as we can get away to flee. And so in a trauma response, this understanding with McLean's research of the triune brain, what comes online first and foremost is that first, the basal ganglia, that question, am I alive? Am I breathing and blinking? So it's a bottom-up orientation. And so total loss of the prefrontal regulation, and the bottom-up attention is what's going to come online. And our survival reflexes in the body, this is nanoseconds that happens, but pupils dilate, the heart beats faster, blood pressure increases, and this is so that we can get away. However, as it says here, our brains are not wired this way to do fight or flight, and we evolved to freeze first and then flee. And fighting is only in the service of fleeing unless there's no other option. We are predators, yes, but we have to remember that there were other animals that predated upon us. And I mentioned Rebecca Campbell. She did research at Michigan State and contacted the writers of the show Law and Order SVU, if you've ever heard of it. Wrote this concept into an episode of Tonic Immobility, of describing that 50% of the survivors of a sexual assault will have an overflow of a parasympathetic response, which will cause their body essentially to shut down and lose all coherence. And later, the writers on the show said that the response from the general public was so overwhelming because people wrote into the show and called in to say, my God, I had no idea. All this time I've been thinking I should have fought because it says fight, flight, freeze. And now I finally understand that my body had a visceral response, that first what I did was I shut down. And so that freeze is the brief response when danger is perceived, highly alert, ready for action. And so I'm going to show you a video here. This is a little baby fawn, and that's Mama. You can mute it. So Mama's just coming into the road here to say, oh, and the baby was frozen and now is realizing it's okay. Oh. And now they're okay. Make sure. Oh, so cute. But that first response is to freeze, to see, am I okay? And even, on the Serengeti plain, the gazelle, the freeze may last for a nanosecond. But the first response is to freeze, to see, am I safe? Where can I run to? And if we're overwhelmed in the moment, then we shut down. So if we're not able to escape or appease, then the next thing that will happen is that we will dissociate or we will mentally escape. We may realize that physically I can't get out of here, and so if physically I can't get out, what I'll do is emotionally, mentally, I will get out. One way or another, I will get out. And so people have the experience of dissociating. And tonic immobility, a response in up to 50% of victims experience this tonic immobility of the overwhelming rush of the parasympathetic nervous system to shut down so that in a life-threatening response, I can survive. Collapse immobility, the drastic survival reflex, heart gets massive parasympathetic input, resulting in extreme decreases in heart rate and blood pressure. The brain releases high stress chemicals, high amygdala activity, and our memory gets fragmented and encoded. I'm going to go through 4 different types of memory and how they're affected by the trauma, and then start talking about the experiential way back in how we can access healing. So, but just to focus on the islands of memory, I'll give you a visual overview of that. But in thinking about these 4 different kinds of memory, so there's explicit memory, semantic memory. What it is, it's general knowledge facts. For example, you know what a bicycle is and how trauma can affect it. It can prevent information from different parts of the brain from combining to make a whole semantic memory. And the related brain area is the temporal lobe and the inferior parietal cortex. Again, what I said in hour 1 is healing. In large part, if you know narrative therapy, it is about recreating and creating a whole new cohesive whole, a whole new narrative. And so the semantic memory is part of what's going to help people create a new story. And trauma can interfere with the elements that led to that initial trauma, so that people don't have a sense of what it is that happened. We see this, and again, thanks to Rebecca Campbell, who really changed our understanding of survivor recall. But until this research came online, there was a whole movement, there was a whole sense of forensic studies and interviews of survivors by police who weren't able to really hold empathy for survivors because that's okay. There's no way not to, yeah. Yes. So would you just breathe and just, so look at me. Yeah. Yeah. You're here, you're safe, I see you. Okay, all right. Safe journeys. All right, so the whole forensic understanding of trauma was affected because survivors when asked what happened, would say, I don't know. I can't say. Well, what time was it? Well, who was there? What were they wearing? And so semantic memory is deeply affected by that. And another kind of memory, episodic memory, so the autobiographical memory of an event or experience. The example is you remember who was there and what street you were in when you fell off your bicycle. How trauma can affect it can shut down episodic memory and fragment the sequence of events. And the related brain area is the hippocampus, creating and recalling episodic memory. So the hippocampus gives the amygdala context. The amygdala is the part of the brain where time just really doesn't exist. When we do experiential therapy with people, when we do psychodrama, people enter into something called the psychodramatic trance. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the episodic memory can be affected by the trauma. The implicit memory, we can't see that up there, but so this one is the emotional memory. That's the memory of emotions you felt during the experience. And the example is a wave of shame or anxiety grabs you the next time you see your bicycle after the big fall. And how trauma can affect it. After trauma, a person can get triggered and experience painful emotions, often without context. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that plays the role there. And finally, procedural memory, what that is, the memory of how to perform a common task without actively thinking. The example is you can ride a bike automatically without having to stop and recall how it's done. And then how trauma can affect that. Trauma can change patterns of procedural memory. So you might tense up and unconsciously alter your posture, which could lead to pain or even numbness. And the striatum is associated with producing procedural memory. So in talking about the experiential process, it cannot be overstated that staying in the here and now and letting the client experience this present moment is what can help the person come back out of the spiral of shame and in that vortex of I'm 3 again or I'm 5 years old again. Staying in the here and now, and the therapist grounding the person and saying, what are you feeling, really is starting the way back. And I've said before that we don't, as experiential or psychodramatic therapists, we don't have to go big. One of my trainers, Mary Bellafato, says there's no reason to complicate a one-car funeral. If there's one car, let it be one car. If there's just the little bit that can be done, do the little bit. And so the focus of the therapist working with the client in that moment, this is what I love about Gestalt. It's Pearl's talked about the phenomenological approach. That it's the phenomena. What are you feeling? What's the phenomenon you're feeling right now? And so someone, for example, might stand like this and do this. And so in that therapeutic moment, the therapist listening to the here and now and watching the person may say, what's going on there? And in experiential terms, may say, if your hand could speak, what would it say right now? Or if your hand could make a noise, what noise might it make right now? And suddenly that person has gone from out there, not thinking about and not realizing, to, aha, and give a voice to. Again, coming back to the concept of the left brain, of giving a voice to that 1-year-old or the 3-year-old who couldn't put to voice. A Gestalt therapist might say, if they see this, they may say, make that bigger. And so that becomes this, and that becomes this. And so suddenly you've engaged your body in the experience, in the moment, of what your body is trying to say. I don't know if it was Tion Dayton who coined it, but I know from her writings and from my own trainers talk about being in the psychodramatic trance. And what that is essentially, if I'm in a psychodrama group or I'm an experiential exercise, and I have someone who's playing my uncle, and someone's playing my mother, and someone's playing my father, in that moment, because we're accessing the parts of the brain that don't know time, in that moment, that is my mother, that is my aunt, that is my brother. And I've done dramas where they're mowing the yard outside, or that there's construction going on, or there's yelling, and that person has no earthly concept that things are going on outside in that moment, because in that moment, they're 10. And they are having a recreative, a reparative experience where they are now able to say the thing that they wish they had been able to say, to do the thing they wish they'd been able to do, to stand up for that little one, that inner child, that they wish someone had done something or said something for them, that in that moment they own their space. So, cannot be overstated that staying in the here and now and watching and modeling and creating the space, the safe space for the client to explore and to voice and to feel will help and start bridging the way back out of their intellectualizing, out of their denial, and into the felt experience, so they can start feeling really the grief and the loss. Because really it is grief and loss work. It's all grief and loss work. It's the loss of the child, of the mother, or of the father, or of the safe home. Security. This is a conceptualization of how we take in data, how we memorize things. And so I walk in a room because my anxiety level is always at about a 5.5. Everywhere I go, I'm super anxious, and so I'm constantly, and we all do this, we create biases. We look at people and think safe, unsafe, pleasant, unpleasant, safe to engage with. And we order and make sense of our world. And so, right or wrong, we put people and experiences in categories. And the categories make what is an unsafe and unreliable world suddenly more habitable. So that at the end of my experience, and this can happen in 1 second, I've walked in a room and I'm often completely wrong, right? So I'm completely wrong about people and reads and about situations, but at least in my mind, I've put things into categories. And this is a representation of what analyzation looks like. This next slide would be a representation of what trauma does to this experience. It creates a disparage and like a disparate understanding of memory, language, experience, and that's why when we ask people, when we ask them to engage their left brain or the Broca's area, when we ask them initially, what were you feeling? Or after surviving a trauma, what were you wearing? What time was it? Who was there? I don't know. And unfortunately, and we are slowly, forensically coming up to speed with an understanding of this is what it's like, but unfortunately for many years, our investigators approached survivors who had this understanding of what happened to them and came away with an understanding that, oh, it wasn't real, or they're making it up, or they can't say. Case closed. Anais Nin said, we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. And one of my favorites, Esther Perel, said, time does not exist on its own. You have to give it meaning. You have to shape it. It is specifically in that experiential model of even its most basic form of I see you, I hear you. Of giving people the space to feel and to recognize, oh, I'm having a feeling. And this is what that feeling might be. Of giving people a vocabulary of feelings. That is where we give it meaning and we start shaping it and we start developing that cohesive whole story. Let's see. In my work, the question that people show up with, was it trauma? This is what I give them, and this is what I give them the space for. It was trauma. I tell people they have every right to their experience, and they have a right to their pain in their own story. And finally, that their history is not their destiny. It is endemic to us as practitioners, and for anybody who leads this work and who does this work, endemic to us for us to do our work, for us to be able to hold the space for someone. So for us to be aware and connected with our own polyvagal systems, with our own grounding, with our own safety of making sure that this space is okay so that as you start emoting, I have the space to model and to meet you. That I am showing up with the ability to truly match you and not impose my own worldview and not impose my own system or label you as problematic or borderline or difficult. That I can meet you in a space and say, I get it, and you're welcome here. And that is all I have for this morning. So, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I had a comment and a question. First
Yes.
of all, I'd like to say that Onsite does amazing trainings, professional trainings. I've been there several times. I can't recommend them enough.
Yeah.
And they learn by doing. It's an incredible environment. My second question was, with that triune brain, if there's a lot of ACEs, you're saying that prefrontal cortex comes back on in 20 minutes. But I've had other people that I've been around the experience of getting really triggered and not being able to get back out of survival mode.
Yes.
So I'm curious as to whether childhood trauma, like if that's a normal person, right? Like 20 minutes and you're back. If you've had a lot of childhood trauma, is that still true, or does that affect the ability to come back online?
Yeah, so it's 20 minutes from the last stimulation. So, so if I look at you and you look at me and you give me the face, and that to me, I read that face as I'm in trouble or I'm in danger, I may walk away and I could be replaying that face in that moment for the next 2 hours. And so it's not 20 minutes from the event, it's the 20 minutes from the space. So here's what I want to say about that. There's a whole phenomenal book called The Power of Habit. I have about 8 pairs of these everywhere. Sometimes I'm not wearing them. And what people will see me do is in the middle of a talk or presentation, I will, not wearing these, push my glasses up on my nose. Why do I do that? Because I'm stupid. No, I'm not stupid. Because it's procedural memory. And so part of the work in Experiential is training people to get in the habit to use the tools when they don't need them so they can use the tools when they do need them. That's procedural memory. So that when I'm not triggered, I have access to deep breathing, meditative practice, staying in the here and now, grounding myself. Those are all things that I can work and move into my procedural memory so that when I am triggered, I can shorten that window. And I can have a metacognitive, I can think about the thing that I'm being triggered about and realize, oh, what's happening right now is I'm being triggered, I'm having feelings, this is where that's probably tied to, I get it. And so the procedural memory allows me to access restorative practices instead of staying awash in the HPA axis.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I spend too much time in the past and I spend too much time in the future.
Yeah.
And I know that I can only experience now through my senses. So you said something about a sort of brilliant trick that the brain does, because I have experienced psychodrama. I know it has power. So how do I get to the past? You mentioned it, but it was sort of went over my head. So too much in the past and too much in the
Sure.
future. I experience now through my senses. It says that there was something that the brain did brilliantly, but it had no time.
Yeah, so the psychodrama, the therapist essentially, whether it's experiential or psychodrama, will read the person's warm-up to see where the energy is. And we go where the energy is. I always tell my clients, I will never take you somewhere you're not ready to go. I won't make you see something you're not ready to see. So we go where the energy is. If there's energy for something around a history, around a memory, around a moment, then we follow that together. And then following that together, it's like going into the open door, and the warm-up leads to the being in the psychodramatic trance, and then the healing comes from that. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure, but I think it will be.
I'm not sure either. So for example, I was doing an intervention once with a client, empty chair technique, where the person was speaking with their abuser. There was no energy there. And I thought, okay, well so there's no energy here, and I checked it with the person, that there's nothing going on here. How about we do something different? And so what I did was I took the chair, I put it up on my desk. That symbolized the relationship of power between the person she was confronting and herself. When I put the chair up on the desk, she immediately connected with that. And so it's about following that energy. When I put that chair up on the desk, she was now 7 years old. And so it's following the gut of the moment and the spontaneity. Moreno talked a lot about spontaneity and creativity and authenticity. If we can follow that moment in the gut and see where's the energy, then that can lead us into the psychodramatic trance.
Just something that's a trigger.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So, I'm 40-year-old woman. Until the age of 38,
think I've had one single day when I didn't experience trauma in my life.
Mhm.
And somewhere in my journey, I became super ambitious, become a tech entrepreneur, and doing so many things. I've read a lot of work from Dr. Joe Dispenza, how I got to learn about Bowlby brain and everything,
Mhm.
and read a lot of law of attraction. Now, doing all that work, I feel, okay, now I should be able to deal with my life. I should be able to get up at this time and should be able to do, and the clarity's still not there.
Mhm.
And after doing all that work, and it's highly frustrating.
Yes.
I wonder if there are any advice.
Yeah, so one of the quotes that I use, it's Christine Langley-Oba, that we repeat what we don't repair. And if there's any leftovers,
I believe I've worked hard enough to address all the issues, and I'm aware, I'm conscious, I meditate every day, I practice spiritual values and really instill them, eat well. I feel I've processed everything,
mhm,
and I don't know what still could be possible.
right? Isn't that frustrating?
It's hugely frustrating,
Yes.
because that's all every single day. That's what I would work out. Okay, this is not working. What's the solution?
Right.
I've stopped working on looking at the problem. I usually go compulsive with finding the solution.
Mm.
And I go find, okay, this is my problem. If I can't solve it, who's the person? Go find that person in the whole world.
Yes.
And I will not solve the problem, but still there's this vibration in the body, and then I have to go through my day when I've got to study, I've got to respond to tenders and everything, and then I'm still working with this. And
So for what it's worth, part of my recovery, I'm learning that my problems aren't, some of them aren't solvable, and some of them must be, I need to see them and to learn to live with them, or to learn to make peace with them, or ask what they're here to teach me. This is totally, I don't know if this will fit or not, but Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a book years ago called A Wizard of Earthsea. A Wizard of Earthsea, and it's a story of a very powerful young magician who unleashes devastating evil upon the land. And in the journey, can I tell you that? Can I spoil it? I apologize. In the journey, he realizes that the evil that he unleashes, it's a reflection of it's very Jungian, so it's a very reflection of himself and of his darkest tendencies. He named the evil, and it was his own name. And so learning about our shadow selves, about our dark side, our Jungian qualities, and learning to make peace with and accept those qualities, I think, is part of also my ongoing recovery in learning to utilize and live with them. Chase asked me earlier, like, are you nervous? No, never. Always. But it's part of my journey, and we can talk if you have. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. I found it very helpful. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about forgiveness. I don't have a clear, direct question, but you came up very briefly.
The other F word.
And
Yes.
you kind of said forgiveness. That's a
Yes.
Big question.
Yeah, so a lot of research into the topic, and what we're finding is that not merely from a spiritual, mental facility, but also deeply biological. There are effects that happen when we release the debt that other people owe us, and make the realization that the people who wrong us will never be able to repay us for the wrongs that they did. And not forgiving has a cascade of cardiovascular, of inflammation, of deeply physical responses, holding on to the anger and the resentment. And so the practice of forgiveness, and it is a practice, it's not an event, but the practice of forgiveness will start to bring healing and to start righting the systems that are wrong, because we're just not meant to live with that level of resentment, and it ends up harming and causing great dis-ease upon the person holding on to the resentment over the long haul, if that's helpful.
thank you.
Yeah. We're at time. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.